On today's show, I am joined by Jackson Frank, who writes about the NBA across the board in the internet circles. And we talk about the Hawks, the East, young guys in the Hawks, all that fun stuff. All of that is on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1546 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Thursday here in September. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook, which is a sports partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. If you're a new customer, get that $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. And also at the top of the podcast, I should tell you to make us your first listen each and every day here at the Locked On Hawks podcast. Please subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast, places like Apple and Spotify, YouTube, etc. And I am joined on today's podcast by Jackson Frank, who writes about the NBA at UPROXX, at SB Nation, and other places across the internet. He's been on the show before. Great guest, good friend of mine, talking about the NBA world. And it's actually part 1 of 2 with Jackson. The main show is one you're about to listen to right now. Then we sort of have a little bit of a shorter bonus episode attached to it with some stuff about the Eastern Conference and where the Hawks stack up in that conference. But beyond that, some just general Hawk stuff, and also, young guys. He wrote AJ Griffin recently, so that's definitely on the podcast as well. And just a good sort of late summer, early fall catch up because training camp is coming soon, and we're building up to all of that stuff in the coming days. So without any further delay, myself and Jackson diving into the Hawks right now. I am joined now by friend of the podcast, Jackson Frank. Thank you for coming on the podcast, my friend. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to talk some Hawks and Eastern Conference outlook.
I appreciate you doing it. Is what we talked about before we started recording. It's I think there's the dead zone, and then there's I guess we're not in the dead zone anymore because it's September, but it feels like we've all kind of talked about everything at this point in time. But I do appreciate you coming on, and I try to avoid deep Hawks conversations. People that don't cover the team every day. But I think that you have, number one, you've written about the Hawks recently, which we'll talk about, your AJ Griffin thing that I wanted to talk about. But I also know that you watch everything, and I appreciate you being willing to jump on. Before we get into some of the depth stuff potentially, I want to just ask you this, especially because you cover the whole league. What do you kind of make of the Hawks the last couple years, and especially last year, struggling basically? I know it wasn't a disaster, but they ended up in the play-in after, not kind of going, not all in, but they've pushed a lot of chips in. And what did you make of last year's Hawks team? And the fact that, as we look ahead in a second, they didn't do a ton to overhaul the roster. So it's pretty relevant how they played last year.
Yeah, I think I totally got the idea of trying to get another very, very good ball handler. After watching that Heat series, it was clear they needed that. But then because of the trade of Herter and losing some other shooting, they kind of opened up other holes that made it really tough for DeJounte and Trey to do a lot of what they like as ball handlers, especially DeJounte likes to get to the mid-range and operate there. And, if there's shooters open, he's a pretty solid kick-out passer. But when there's not guys open, he's kind of going to prefer to take some of those contested mid-range jumpers that maybe aren't always the best shot, but he doesn't always have a better option. So that was a tough thing. But, the last couple of years, they've kind of been the classic start slow and pretty well. I think if you compare the quality of play they had by, let's say games 3 through 6 of that Celtics series versus October, November, December, completely different teams. Obviously, Quin Snyder, replaced Nick McMillan changed some things, but I don't think that was the only shift at all. But I'm fairly optimistic about the Hawks this year, but I feel like I said that at least 2 years ago. I wasn't as huge a fan last year. But yeah, it's just tough because they kind of seem like they've been a slow starting team, but that could be, maybe that's kind of the way McMillan's style was. I don't know exactly, but you'd hope they can maybe start quicker this year and not be, faces an uphill battle in the first round, 2 years in a row playing a team in the first round that ends up making it to the brink of the finals. The Heat 2 years ago and the Celtics last season. So like you said, they kind of went all in, but they do have some options now, and I got why they went in, make a big swing, but some of the gaps that, as a result of that big swing, put them in kind of a lateral spot from the year prior.
Yeah, it's interesting. I probably am due for a deep dive into this, but that you brought it up, the fact that they've started slow and finished strong, even the now infamous 2021 year when they made the conference finals, they got hot before that. Like there's been, I think people locally know this, but people nationally kind of like, oh, they got hot in the playoffs. Like, no, they had been hot since like January of that year. Like they played at a super high level going into the playoffs. And yeah, they have never been able to recapture that or at least have it consistency. I know my friend Glenn Willis and I talked about this all the time. Like the thing that they never had is consistency. Like in this entire run, they never been able to put it together for a long period of time. And everyone has their opinions as to why that might be. And you referenced Quin Snyder. I guess I'll ask you this too. Just I guess was on my list anyway. I mean, they're kind of banking on him to be like the big addition. I mean, they did some other stuff, the Sadiq Bey move, which is certainly interesting and probably gets under discussed because it happened at the deadline versus the offseason. But Snyder's still like number 1A on their change list in terms of having a full camp and all that stuff. I know you covered him in Utah like everybody else did too, but what did you make of that? And then moving early and also the fact that he got that kind of, I don't even know what to say, appetizer on this team. It was so weird. I feel like I keep saying that over and over again, but I want to stress like how odd that whole situation was and him having a different staff that wasn't his, and now they've overhauled it all. But how much stock do you put in that coaching change? Because that is probably the thing that they're trying to sell everybody else on. Like, hey, it's kind of the same team, but we have a different voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the the offense is really good once Snyder took over. I know they were still kind of hovering around 500. They have obviously the hilarious, not one game over above streak for a while.
Yeah.
But the offense is really good. They played quicker. For some reason, I can't find the number. I'm spacing on the numbers, but I know they're like top 5 in offensive rating and much quicker pace than they were under McMillan, or at least transition frequency. Pace is a tough one because sometimes it involves kind of how good you are on defense, and so that impacts things. But and then in the playoffs, their offense gave Boston, which was a very good defense. It was a flawed defense, but gave Boston a lot of issues, more issues than the Sixers offense did. And the Sixers were, a top 3 or 4 offense the entire year once James Harden came back in December. So I guess not the entire year, but about a 4.5 month stretch there. And so I think that's really what you're looking for, right? You're looking for the offense to be a top 3-4 unit, which, with the personnel they have, with Trae leading the way, that's what you need. And you want them to be, above average defensively. The point of attack off defense is kind of the big issue, but you would hope that if you can get 48 minutes of Capella and Okongwu in there, your defense is probably going to be okay, right? Like, I mean, those are 2 very good high-level defenders. With Capella, you're more of a traditional drop. Okongwu gives you a little more switchability, a little less rebounding, of course, because of his size and his foul issues as well. But I think the path to being like a team that avoids the play-in is to be, a top 5 offense and a top 15, 16 defense, which is a little tough given the way the point of attack defense looked last year. I know, everyone's aware of Trey's issues there, and we've talked about it, Brad, but DeJounte wasn't very good on that end last year either. And so it just puts a lot of stress on Capella and Okongwu, who again, I think are very good defenders, but they're not in the Gobert, Jaren, kind of that defensive player of the year tier where you can kind of prop up a defense to top 10-ish levels, even if the personnel around you is really limited. So, you're hoping can Bogey look a little more like he did a couple years ago when he was pretty useful as a point of attack guy? Can DeAndre look a lot better than he did? Just the lateral quickness I thought was much worse last year than it was maybe even the year prior once he found his footing, and then 2 years before that. So, I'm optimistic about the Hawks overall this year, but I do understand it kind of requires them to find that consistency that you mentioned has eluded them, right? Like, you've seen good stretches of Bogey and DeAndre defensively, but you've never really kind of had it coalesce with Okongwu and Capella being healthy and all that. So, I mean, it's like any team, consistency is key to accrue a lot of wins in the regular season. But I do see a pathway to where it happens, but I also see quite a few, ways where an injury or 2 hits and this team is 8th in offense and 22nd in defense, and they're playing at a 42 win pace like we saw most of last year.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Get ready for the NFL season right now with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. By the way, if you're a new customer, bet $5, you get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed with FanDuel. Plus, every customer who bets $5 can also get $100 off Sunday ticket from NFL, YouTube, and YouTube TV. Beyond the awesome perks of signing up right now, FanDuel has point spreads and over-unders, money lines, player props, futures, and much more. The app at FanDuel is also very safe and secure. They cover the whole range of sports you might be interested in at this point. That includes, of course, the NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, WNBA, college basketball, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, and much more. And now is the best possible time to join FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Kick off the NFL season with us and an offer that you do not want to miss right now. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. This is not a question that you will have stewed on as much as I have or Hawks fans would have, but I'm interested in what you think because I know you've talked about Okongwu a lot. There's this whole debate about them bringing both guys back still, Capella and Okongwu still being here. And I'm kind of, I've said before, I'm pretty surprised that Capella is still on the roster. I love Clint. I think he's very good. It's just that if you asked me 3 years ago when they drafted Okongwu, if they both still be on the roster in year 4, I would have fallen on my chair if you said yes. And they're still,
especially how Okongwu's looked, right? Like if you would say that Okongwu's a very good NBA player.
Right. He's already kind of, not that, I mean, I've gone back and forth like how to frame it because he's not proven as a starter. He's never been asked to do that, but I think we kind of know he's good. We don't know quite how good maybe, but he's not because he hasn't been asked to do that for 30 minutes a night, but we kind of know he's a good player. And what do you make of that? Like even philosophically, like the concept of basically the way that they sell it in a way that I agree. I sort of agree is like, we want to have, and we do have 48 minutes of good center play. And I think there's some value in that, but like, what do you make of that whole thing as someone from the outside?
Yeah, I would, at this point in Okongwu's career, I would lean toward it being smart to move Capella, but I also do get the fact that Capella has always been a guy who's he's optimized when he's a little lower minutes, right? Like a guy in that 27, 29 minute range. You try and get up to 33, 34. You really kind of start to see some play fall off. He's a much better rebounder than Okongwu. I mean, his rebounding was a huge reason they beat the Heat in that playing game back in the spring. I mean, the whole offensive rebounding was huge, but him especially was awesome there. And the fact that he fouls less and he gives you a different look defensively. Like I said, Okongwu can play drop. He's good at that, but his appeal is that switchability. And the Hawks roster isn't super conducive to that, right? You don't want Trey guarding up. You don't even really want DeJounte guarding up. I'm not sure you want Bogey or Hunter, as the way they look last year, guarding down a ton. So it's a tough spot. Like I said, I lean toward moving Capella at this point, but I do understand completely why they've not gone that way. Just because like you said, like if you're gonna make a big move to acquire like DeJounte Murray and trade off some future first round picks, you're kind of shifting to say we're going to be in win now mode. And it's hard to balance that with, all right, we're going to give Okongwu his first crack at, full-time starting center minutes while trying to maximize an all-star in Trae Young and a very good player in DeJounte Murray. It's kind of the core of our team. So it's a precarious position, but it's also one, and I know it's a different front office to an extent now, but it's also one that they probably should have been better prepared to navigate because everyone basically, I mean, everyone knew that Okongwu maybe didn't have the highest ceiling in the draft, but pretty much expected him to be a pretty good player pretty quickly. And that's not to diminish Clint or his exploits, but it doesn't feel like they necessarily kind of had a long-term vision. Maybe they do. Maybe they trade him pretty quickly early on in the season because Okongwu looks great, but it does feel like Okongwu being so good basically from the outset kind of surprised them. And they haven't really had a pathway to shore up other holes that that come with draft using the last high draft pick they've had on a center who's behind another pretty good quality center.
Yeah, it's so odd, having covered it every single day. Like there were times where it would have made sense to move Clint there, but if you kind of big picture it, like you said, like it's understandable that they haven't done it because in the way that there's an argument about how much Trey has to do with it because Trey pretty famously loves Clint and will tell anybody that, and the organization knows that, and I don't know how much that has to do with it, but I would put it on the list somewhere. It probably has more than 1% of the pie as to why Clint's still here, and also you can debate how all in they are, but one of the things and one of the reasons why you kind of alluded to it is that this is a team that's been very clearly trying to win the entire time and like kind of pushing their foot down to not all the way to the floor maybe, but like they're trying to win and they have pressure from the top to win. So that kind of incentive, when you're kind of, especially with Nate, who was a very short-term focused guy, moving Clint would have made you worse, and it still would make you worse now. I mean, that's the thing. Like, as much as I love Okongwu, if you just trade Clint Capela for very little return in the short term, you're not going to be as good. Like, Okongwu might be good, but like your Bruno Fernando, who I kind of like, actually is not the same as those guys. Like, you're going to have a drop off there. So it's really philosophical, and I wonder now, as kind of circling back to Quin, like, do they just want to see what it looks like with a more, Quinn coached Rudy? So I'm not saying that Clint is Rudy, but he's much more like Rudy than Okongwu is. And I don't know. And Snyder has this voice in the front office, but he's not, he's very quick to say he's not in charge. How much emphasis does he have? It's like this very interesting push and pull for a team that didn't, quote unquote, do a lot in the offseason. They have these decisions that they have to make in the next year, whether it's financial, whether it's center. They just paid DeJounte, which made sense given the number that he took. But it's fascinating. I'm sure it is on your side too. But it's even, if you want to get really into the weeds, like day to day, it gets pretty twisty in some respects.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense why Trey likes Capella, right? He's a really good screener. Yeah. He's a much bigger lob threat. Like Okongwu is a much more diverse role threat, right? Because he has better touch, he has a little more footwork, but he's much smaller. He's undersized center. Like it's harder to find those lobs. Like Trey already has his own things to navigate when he gets inside the paint and at the rim because he's so small. So if he has the kind of the automatic lob to a guy who's got good catch radius, bigger, it's an easier life for him than if he's playing with a 6'8", 6'9" center who again is very good, but that's just the natural limitations of a guy who's a little undersized, and that was one of the reasons that maybe he did fall a little bit in the draft. He didn't fall too far, but if he was maybe 6'11", 7 foot more of a natural size center, he could have gone maybe top 3, top 4, might have been a little more in that conversation. So I totally get the appeal of that. And the reality too is there's a lot of really good centers in the league. Obviously, you get to the top with Jokic and Embiid, but you get down to the 10th, 11th, 12th guys, and you're yeah, that guy might be a top 50-ish player still, top 55. I know that's kind of where you should be if you're a top 10 center in a 5-position league, yeah. but still, just the point being I understand why there's maybe not a robust market for Capella, and you look okay, the team that made sense was the Mavericks, but then they went and they signed Derek Lively III, or they drafted Derek Lively III and traded for Rashawn Holmes. We don't know kind of what those guys are. One's a rookie, one hasn't really been in the rotation for about a year and a half, but that kind of felt like the most natural suitor. And then you look around, you're I don't know what else is really out there, and does it make sense? Does it shore up enough other holes that you might leave open if you try and trust Okongwu for 34, 35 minutes a night, given where he struggles and kind of where he excels?
And they talked to Dallas, and it made sense. And the thing is, it's like the Hawks have not been willing to listen on Capella. He's been available in trade. It's not they're saying, Trey loves him, we're not going to trade him. They talked about Capella to multiple teams. That got reported, and I can confirm that. He's been available. It's just that they're asking, as they have been, and that's one of the things about this Hawks team. They've asked for market price on all of their guys, and every year they've never been. I guess the Collins trade was the first time where they thought they were maybe more in a desperation mode on we're going to move this guy now kind of thing. They've been very open to, and I think generally speaking, it's a good idea to be kind of measured. Okay, these guys are available, but we're not going to give any of them away. And I think the Herter deal I did not like, but it was financially motivated, and they basically had their choice of deals, I think, is what I would put from what I've heard, that would have gotten them under the tax. As much as they hate that concept, that's what happened. But they got the first round pick for him, and it's not a sexy pick, but it was a real asset back. I didn't love the trade, but it is what it is. But other than the Collins trade, they haven't lowered their asking price on any of these guys, and I get it, but that also leads you to being kind of more. I almost said stagnant. What's a more positive word than stagnant? Kind of just holding serve on your guys. You're not gonna. I mean, I talked about this actually earlier this week on my mailbag show, but I would have expected. From the outside, I know our mutual friend Andrew Kelly talked about this a lot. The infamous consolidation trade has never happened. It's been 3 years. I would have bet that on them doing more than one probably between now and then, and they've never made a consolidation trade in this entire era. And of course, part of that's because they moved Herter in a one-player trade and they moved Collins in a one-player trade, but they've never done the put them all together and go get a guy. Even DeJounte ended up being a draft pick focused trade. So it's just a really interesting roster building scenario, and I mean we can get into that or not, but it's just I wonder actually while we're here, I wonder what you think of the Hawks organizationally. I know that's not necessarily your beat, but as far as what you can on the outside, you're not covering them every day. Does it seem dysfunctional? Because when I ask people around the league to kind of just track it. Some of that's what we talked about in a minute ago. it doesn't always kind of make sense in a vacuum what they're trying to do because they're obviously trying to push in and they keep going to the play-in back-to-back years. So I promise we'll go back to players in a second, but what do you just think about it as a neutral observer from far away?
They seem like they have a preference. I won't say a plan, a preference for what they would like to do and what they like to have the team look like. but haven't really ever found a means of achieving that. And so it's led to a lot of discombobulated decisions that maybe don't always complement one another. So maybe I think probably dysfunction is a fair term. I think there are obviously degrees of dysfunction, right? Like it doesn't
Sure.
necessarily mean they're at the bottom tier of NBA
Yeah.
franchises, but certainly a team I don't think has been streamlined as much as it should. And but I think back to that, how they built around Trey 2 years ago, in the summer of 20, I guess. I mean, the offseason of 20, it was a month and a half or whatever. The year before they really kind of made that leap, going from out of the bubble to the Eastern Conference Finals, and it felt like the plan was, let's put a bunch of shooters around Trey, let's give him a lob threat, let's give him a pick and pop threat, and then just because of some of the things outside of their control, with Bogey's injuries, Hunter in and out of the lineup, Collins and kind of falling off as a shooter and ended up not really being someone that teams ever respected from deep, even when he was putting up good numbers. It kind of threw a wrench in their plans. They've never quite been able to go about kind of balancing that again. And like I talked about earlier, it made sense, with the way the Heat loaded up so much help in the paint and, at the nail against Trey 2 years ago, going and getting DeJounte makes sense. But they're still kind of reeling from, the decisions around that, like the Herter trade and Gallo not being anywhere close. I know Gallo was in the DeJounte trade, but not being anywhere close to as good as he was, in 21. Collins falling off, Herter being gone. So that's kind of where I see it. So yeah, I guess dysfunction is fair, but I wouldn't, put him at the bottom of the league necessarily. But that's just from an outside perspective, doesn't necessarily know the ins and the internal
Yeah.
relationships and decision making process.
I am going to get to the young guys in a second because that was I told you I was going to, but that reminded me we're in the middle of this FIBA run where Bogey's been great and he's been in the news more often, and I've always made this point to the point where my listeners make fun of me. Like the Hawks have always in this run the last 3 or 4 years been their best when Bogey is healthy and Bogey is playing well. Like he is an X factor for them, whatever that means. He's not as important as Trey. No one's saying that, but like he's a really important guy for what they do. And part of it was what you just laid out, like having enough shooting around Trey, number one, but also having a guy who's been a secondary creator for them who can go get his own shot in a way that a lot of guys on this roster, Hunter, Collins, etc., have not always been able to do. He's a pretty good passer too. Defensively, he's taking a step back, but certainly that's what you expect from age-wise. But I wonder what you think of Bogey because, he signed that 4-year extension that was kind of a surprise when it happened, but it's fairly cheap, and he looks great physically right now in a way that he hasn't in a long time. So, knock on wood beyond that. But like, what do you think of Bogey? Because I feel like he gets not talked about very much just for the caliber of player that he is.
Yeah, he gives the Hawks a front court size player. I know he's a wing, but a front court size guy that can create that they've never really had besides like when Gallo was with Atlanta, he was more of a mismatch guy in the post, which is useful. You need that sort of guy. I know that's kind of what they always hope Collins could do more of, but never really kind of streamline that consistency. But he's kind of their only front court guy who can dribble, right? Like, I mean, a guy who can run some pick and rolls, whether it's up top, usually from the wing, or just kind of create from the wing, get into that mid-range jumper that he likes. Obviously, as a step back jumper from 3 as well. And yeah, he's kind of the metronome, I think, for kind of where the Hawks are as a ceiling team, right? Or what the ceiling of the team is, I should say. And Herter, they kind of tried to make, he saw some flashes of creation throughout his time, but it never quite got to the point it needed. I think he's just never quite kind of developed that core strength to operate in the mid range the same way that the Bogey is when he's at his best. So yeah, he's really important, and it's been great to kind of see him healthy and playing well in FIBA. I think it's a nice sign that he's comfortable with where he's at, physically, that he's willing to play in the late summer before your training camp starts up in a month or so. So yeah, I think if he's a guy who can really kind of help diversify that offense, if they can play, Trey, DeJounte, Bogey lines for 12 minutes a game and really have a ton of offensive firepower out there alongside, maybe Sadiq's at the 4 and Capella's at the 5, and you've got a lot of shooting, a lot of ball handling there. And so yeah, he feels like a guy who's just really important to kind of what they do, because he's I could be missing a guy, I guess maybe like, among their playoff rotation from last year, he kind of felt like the only guy who drew really hard closeouts as an off-ball player, right? Like AJ Griffin does, but he wasn't in the playoff rotation. Right. Sadiq Bey does, I guess, to an extent, but you can kind of be a little more tepid because Sadiq, he was better at it in Atlanta, but he is kind of the guy who sometimes passes up open threes that you would like him to take and whatnot. I know that again, that was a lesser problem, in Atlanta that was Detroit. But yeah, Bogey is kind of the guy who draws the hardest closeouts among off-ball players who can, station comfortably alongside Trey and DeJounte, depending on kind of who's out there leading the charge.
For sure, and these lineups are not going to be one of the questions this team has that I won't bore you with is like, can they deploy two-way lineups? Because if you could put together an offensive lineup that is terrifying with Bogey and Bay on the wings, alongside Trey, DeJounte, and a roll man. Like that's fairly unstoppable given the shooting that those guys have, and Bogey's a dynamic threat and all that stuff. It's just that, can you guard with those guys? And that's, of course, a big question that will probably not be answered, at least in a positive sense, between now and then. But I mean, one more thing on Bogey, Bay's not great here either. One of the questions as I want to transition this to the young guys in a second, but like as good as they've been on offense under Trey, which has basically always been the case. Trey is an offense that's good on his own, but a limitation that they've always had that will hopefully become less of one as guys like Jalen Johnson in particular, maybe AJ as well. They have not had the guys, the dribble, pass, and shoot guy, which is kind of funny because that was the Travis Schlenk mantra when he first took over, was dribble, pass, and shoot. It became this like meme. He just said it 100 times all the time. And then they had these guys where, DeAndre Hunter, certainly not a pass guy, not really a dribble guy or a pass guy. John Collins got better at it, but a much more traditional big, improved there, but not a dynamic passer by any means, nor creator. Even Sadiq Bey, like not a great dribble pass guy necessarily. Bogey is, but that's why you start getting to guys like Jalen and to a lesser extent AJ, and I feel like those guys the theory, going back to what we talked about earlier, like the theory of the case kind of includes one of them or two of them maybe between those guys in the Congo kind of breaking out. And I'm going to tee it up this way. I got some people, I don't know if they were mad at me or not, but I said on a recent show that basically, this doesn't even seem controversial as I say it out loud, but the way I framed it was, this team can be really good with Trey and DeJounte as their top two players. I believe that. There's a way to do that. You know what I mean? Like a clear top two. But they don't really have a path to being a title contender with Trey and DeJounte as their clearly top two players. That's kind of the way that I laid it out. And I basically said that was a way of saying that number one. And also, I'm not putting too much pressure on AJ or Jalen or Okongwu, but like they kind of need one of those guys or two of those guys to like really become like difference makers. Does that make sense? And again, and then we'll sort of dig into those guys, but like they're kind of on the roster, barring a huge trade. I mean, internally, like those three candidates, maybe Kobe Buffkin, if you just love him, are kind of their way to turn the dial a little bit, it seems like.
Yeah, I think, when I wrote about AJ a couple months ago, I think at this point, one of the things that I said made a lot of sense for him is just how well he kind of fits into that mold offensively alongside Trey. Like kind of not the Bogey mold to an extent. I think Bogey, is a much better passer and kind of more comfortable I know like AJ can use some stuff with his handle, but kind of facing the defense is where I think sometimes young guys kind of struggle in terms of like sizing him up and whatnot. And Bogey's good there, but just with the blend of shooting, the touch from mid range, the close at attacking, how well he reads those things, that's really what you need. And I think with Trey specifically, what I think like if the shooting is as good as it's been in certain years, like you can see a path where maybe he is the best player on a really, really good team. If it's where it was last year, it really kind of struggles. But what he needs it to like kind of be the perfect complement, I think, is maybe less so like a really good secondary career like DeJounte, and more like that second best player should be a high level defensive anchor, right? And if a Congo could get there, maybe, like I said, I'm a little lower on that, just given, it's really hard at that size to be a true anchor. Just because of the rebounding and everything like that, and kind of just sometimes, again, there is just kind of an intimidation factor, right? For bigger guys, players can be more willing to attack a 6'8", 6'9" center than they are a 7-foot center for the most part. It's just the way, human nature is. But if you can get a Congo to a level where he is someone who is a really, really good, not an elite anchor, but a very good anchor, then you have AJ who can average 15, 16, 17, and Trey's doing his thing. Like then there's the core there. That's kind of the process and the formula there. So with AJ, I do understand that, at times maybe like he was prone to dribbling too much and trying to do a little too much. And, I think just based on kind of the style that Quinn gravitated toward in Utah, he wants those ancillary guys to be really quick decision makers, really quick kind of play finishers. And AJ, I understand what he was doing, but it didn't necessarily always make sense for what Quinn kind of gravitated toward with role players there. And just like he's, Snyder's track record is not particularly glamorous for, giving a lot of leeway to young guys, which is not rare among any, any veteran NBA coach. It's just the way it goes, for better or for worse. So yeah, I think AJ is the big key for me there, just kind of based on how I feel about him versus Kongu. With Jaylen, I like a lot of what he does, but it's tough for me to, as much as I kind of like these guys' skill sets, it's tough for me to really kind of buy into the non-shooting, non-center guys. Like I guess I wouldn't say non-shooting, but poor shooting. Like Jaylen is somewhat willing. You can tell there's times where he's more comfortable than others. I get the connective passing, I get the cutting, the play finishing, the weak side rim protection. But it's just tough to survive as a four who doesn't, provide, a ton in the way of space. And if you're playing alongside of a Kongu or a Capella, you look at I think Jalen's will end up being a much better finisher than this. But you look at a guy like Jared Vanderbilt, who was really important to what the Lakers did in the regular season to close out last year, and then I think kind of the first round and part of the second round, the playoffs. But by the time they played the Nuggets in the second half of that Warriors series, he wasn't much of a factor because of his lack of shooting. Again, Jalen's a much better finisher that could prove to be a differentiator, but I think you see some parallels in the archetype as kind of these rangy athletic wings who are quite good defensively, have some ball skills, but don't have the shooting. So I'm a little lower on Jaylen. If he ends up, being a guy who can hit some threes, really draw closeouts and open up the driving game, the connective passing, then I would, be more optimistic about him long term. But it's just tough to have, your 4 and your 5 not be much of threats from outside, as we saw with the Cavs, last year in the first round. So to me, AJ is a guy just based on kind of the tape I've seen among the 3 young players you mentioned, but I'm not, at all married to those, staunchly. I could definitely see ways where I become, I shift one way or the other in terms of favoring one of the other young guys.
Yeah. And on Jaylen, I agree with what you laid out. It's just the internal, and look, I mean, this is the case with every young player, but there are certainly Jaylen zealots who will tell you he's going to be the next Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons with a jump shot was thrown around at one point. But no, it's one of those things where like the package of skills that he has is really intriguing. They all acknowledge that, to your point, like him and the coaching staff in the front, they think he will be able to shoot. The question is whether he'll be able to. And he shot 29%. He's not a total non-shooter, which I know you said. They think there's more there. That's going to be important for him. And also just a half-court role on offense. I mean, that's something that's like the next step for a lot of guys that are his archetype. But, if you see a lot of the clips that make the rounds that get people all excited about Jaylen Johnson, and justifiably so, are him going end to end. And like he's a 6'10" freight train. He can handle the ball. It's very, very impressive. And then you watch him in the half court, and like there isn't a whole lot that they were able to do with him, even when Quinn took over. So that's the next evolution, like baby steps for me, is like, what is his role even in a half court set, especially like you laid out next to a Kongu is not a total non-shooter potentially, but so far he kind of is been, and Capella obviously is a non-shooter. So having 2 of those guys, having him with a non-shooter at center would be tough. And I think there's a lot of belief in a Kongu as a shooter. And they've, I think, intentionally, for myriad reasons, rebounding is one where Jalen's really good, kind of paired Jaylen and Okongwu together a lot and had Jaylen and Capella play less together, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. But they're high on him for sure. And I think Quinn, people even ask me this, like Quinn seemed to favor Jaylen versus AJ at the end of last season. And I think that was kind of normal. I mean, Jaylen was kind of a rookie in some ways. He hadn't played a lot as a rookie, but it was, I think he just trusted his defense more at the end of the day. It was a lot of the reason why that happened too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you mentioned Okongwu not being a non-shooter. You saw like strides in kind of the way he was used and the comfort and the freedom he has as a shooter. Like I think, did he hit his first career 3 pretty shortly into? It
was like the first or second game. Like, and it was, and they made a big deal of it too. Like, I mean, they want him to shoot. They do want him to shoot. We'll see if he's actually able to do that regularly, but like they do want to encourage it at least.
My point there is that like you open up more possibilities because Okongwu is much less entrenched in who he is than Capella. Like, again, Capella, great at a lot of things, but he's also a veteran who, is just never going to be a shooter. So, but like you can run a lot more actions if Okongwu's at least comfortable taking those pick and pop threes, things like that, and Jaylen can roll. Obviously, Jaylen has good size, pretty good bounce, good length. So he's a more of a lob threat. Like he's taller than Okongwu, right? Like I know he's not a center, but like you've got more options with the lob threat, like we talked about earlier, with Trey kind of being someone who really enjoys that as an outlet when he's probing the paint or driving inside. So like again, I like AJ a lot, but I totally understood why Quinn gravitated toward Jaylen as a rotation player last season, just because, like I said, AJ is prone to kind of some of those longer touches. Jaylen has his own issues at times there, but he is a very quick decision maker, especially in an advantage situation. Doesn't always work out because sometimes he takes a three and he's just not a particularly good shooter yet. But sometimes he is able to pump fake a three, open up a driving lane, and then get do a cross court skip to somebody who is a good shooter. So I definitely kind of see a world where like Okongwu or Jaylen ends up being a somewhat of a shooting threat. Again, like there are levels to it in the playoffs.
Yes.
Teams are much more aware because they're scouting you and they're getting to watch you. They're only watching your tape. So I have some questions there. Even if Jaylen gets to a place where he's shooting 34, 35%, if it's low volume, I go back to the Cavs. Like Okoro's been a pretty solid shooter the last couple of years on low volume. Didn't matter. Teams don't care. Because if you're only taking 3 shots a game and you're
John Collins is a good example.
Yeah.
I mean, pre this year when he just but like he shot 39% for three full seasons, but teams just there's a difference there between a hard closeout and a kind of okay, we'll put our hand up and
if you're taking 4 threes a game, you're hitting 38% of them. That you're beating a team 1.5 times a game, they're willing to stag off you to muck up the other 46 possessions that happen, and it's just simple math. Like it's just how it should happen. But I do think the point about Jaylen being good in transition is important because, like I mentioned earlier, they played a lot quicker with when Snyder took over, and there is a lot of kind of dynamism in the Trey likes to go slow, but he can push if he he's kind of a guy where it feels like if he sees guys running with him and sees guys that he feels comfortable with that are good transition players, he's willing to dial it up a little more. Jaylen's one of those guys. I think AJ is kind of an unconventional good transition player in the sense of like he knows where to kind of fill not unconventional, but when you think transition, right, you usually think like the lob threat you can kind of cut to the rim, whereas AJ's really good at kind of finding those pockets in the wings or the corners. And I think Trey's already kind of fairly comfortable at finding him in those spots as well. So DeJounte, I think, is more the guy where he likes to go slower. And that's just, he San Antonio, I think, to my knowledge, I have to look it up, but they never really played fast when he was there. And that was partly, a preference because of the personnel they had, right? They had DeMar DeRozan, they had LaMarcus Aldridge, guys who like to play slowly as well, but DeJounte likes to do that as well. All this to say is I think there's a lot to be excited about with Jaylen. I hope they play really, really quickly and he's out there because of his transition prowess and half court murkiness. But I think him as a long-term answer at the 4 makes a lot of sense if him or Okongwu can be someone who at least you trust to an extent to both hit the occasional 3 and at least draw attention from defenses wherever they are if they're stationed beyond the arc.
All right, that is all with part 1 of myself and Jackson talking about all things Hawks at this point here in early September. And as a reminder, part 2 should be available in your podcast feed of choice, a bonus episode of sorts. So please subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Ratings and reviews appreciated. Follow us on Twitter /X at Locked On Hawks and at BT Rowland on my personal account, patreon.com/BT Rowland for written content on the Hawks as well. And we'll see you all next time.